He had spent 43 years learning how to be invisible, not in the way spies trained for it, not in the way criminals practiced it. Kalen Moore saw invisibility as something else entirely. It was the art of being useful without being noticed, of fixing problems before people knew problems existed, of standing in the corner of crowded rooms with his hands clasped behind his back, watching other people receive credit for work he had done. The Galactic Assembly Hall stretched above him like a frozen waterfall, all white stone and silver architecture that seemed to flow upward into darkness. Delegates from 17 species filled the curved benches, their translators clicking and humming and occasionally screeching when someone forgot to adjust their frequency settings. The air smelled of recycled oxygen and anxiety. Kalen stood against the back wall, his gray uniform blending into the shadows between lighting panels. His fingers rested lightly on the datapad strapped to his forearm, running diagnostics on the assembly's translation matrix. Nothing official, just habit. On the main floor, Ambassador Voss of the Terran Confederation was losing an argument. The Verathi have violated 17 trade protocols in the last cycle alone, Voss said, her voice steady but her antennae, augmented for diplomatic work, a concession to species who read emotional states through movement, twitching at an alarming frequency. They rerouted shipping lanes through contested space without notification. They have refused arbitration 3 times. The Verathi delegate, a being whose body was mostly robe and whose face was mostly suggestion, he made a sound like wind through dead leaves. Your species has occupied this sector for less than 2 of our generations. You arrived late to a negotiation that has been ongoing for centuries. Your understanding of our customs is, forgive me, primitive. Several delegates nodded. The Colossians, who valued tradition above all else, made approving gestures with their upper limbs. The Xylos, who had been in the assembly since before humans had developed written language, remained perfectly still, which was worse than any open hostility. Voss tried again. Custom does not excuse violation of agreed law. Law, the Verathi said, is interpretation. Kalen watched Voss's shoulders drop a fraction of a centimeter. She knew she was losing. She knew the other delegates saw humans as newcomers, as children playing at diplomacy, as a species still young enough to believe rules meant something. He could fix this. The thought arrived unbidden, as it always did. Kalen had spent decades building networks of information, connections, leverage. He knew the Verathi trade minister had secretly rerouted those shipping lanes not out of aggression, but out of desperation. 3 of their border colonies were facing famine after crop failures, and the fastest supply routes passed through contested space. He knew the Colossians had been quietly negotiating their own trade agreements with Verathi breakaway factions, agreements that violated Colossian law and would trigger a constitutional crisis if revealed. He knew the Xylos representative had a grandchild serving on a research station near the contested zone, to a station that relied on human-supplied medical equipment to treat an endemic respiratory disease. He could lay all of this out, piece by piece. He could shift every calculation, change every vote. He had done it before from the shadows, arranging outcomes like furniture in an empty room. His hand drifted toward his datapad. Then he stopped. 43 years. 43 years of standing in corners. 43 years of watching other people receive the credit, the recognition, the simple acknowledgement that they had done something worthwhile. His fingers curled away from the datapad. He refused backup. What he needed was an audience. Kalen stepped forward. The motion was so unusual that several delegates actually paused to look at him. A human moving from the shadows into light. A human without diplomatic insignia, yet without visible rank or title. Just a man in a gray uniform walking toward the center of the assembly floor. Ambassador Voss turned, confusion flickering across her features. She knew him. knew him as the quiet technician who maintained her translation equipment, who always had the right document ready before she asked for it, who seemed to anticipate needs she hadn't yet expressed. She had never seen him leave the wall. "Mr. Moore," she said, "is there a technical issue?" "No, Ambassador." His voice was quiet, unused to carrying across large spaces. "There's a perception issue." The Varathi delegate made that wind-through-leaves sound again. "Humans and their obsession with perception. We deal in reality here." Kalen turned to face the Varathi directly. "Do you? Because reality is that 17 of your border colonies are facing famine. Reality is that you rerouted those shipping lanes because the Confederation was the only government willing to sell you emergency food supplies at reasonable prices, and the contested zone was the fastest route. Reality is that you violated protocols to keep your people from starving." Silence. The Varathi delegates' robes seemed to deflate slightly. "That information is not classified," Kalen said, "just not widely known. You didn't announce the famine because you were afraid it would weaken your negotiating position on other matters. You didn't request formal assistance because you were ashamed. You chose violation over vulnerability." He turned to the Colossian delegation. "And you? Your trade agreements with the Varathi breakaway factions violate Article 7 of your own constitution. If those agreements become public knowledge, your current government falls. That's why you've been so eager to side with the Varathi against human interests. You're hoping to keep them friendly enough to maintain discretion." The Colossian representative made a sound that translators rendered as alarm denial. These are baseless accusations." "I have documentation," Kalen said. "Signed agreements, dated and witnessed. Your own signatures are on 3 of them." The Colossian made no further sound. Kalen turned to the Xylos delegate, who had remained perfectly still throughout the exchange. "And you? Your youngest grandchild serves on Research Station 7 in the contested zone. She has a respiratory condition that requires regular treatment with Terran-manufactured medical equipment. If human-Xylos relations deteriorate, that equipment becomes harder to acquire. You've been voting against human interests to maintain your position with the Varathi, but you've been quietly ensuring those medical shipments continue. Your position is compromised, and you know it." The Xylos delegate did not move, did not speak, did not, as far as anyone could tell, breathe. Kalen turned back to face the assembly. His heart was pounding. His palms were sweating. He had never spoken for this long, never held this much attention. His voice, which had served him faithfully for decades as an invisible instrument, now felt like an unfamiliar tool in his hands. But he kept speaking. "But we spend so much time here debating law and custom and interpretation. We argue about who violated what, who owes what, who has the right to do what to whom. But beneath all of that argument, there is always something simpler: need, fear, love, shame, the things that make us act, and the things we try to hide when we do." He looked at Ambassador Voss. Her antennae had stopped twitching. She was staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. "Humans are young here," Kalen said. "We arrived late. We don't understand all your customs, and we've made mistakes trying to learn them. But we understand need. We understand fear. We understand that laws don't exist to punish. They exist to protect. And when we see someone violating those laws because they're trying to protect their people, we don't want to punish them. But we want to help." The Varathi delegates' robes rustled. "Help! You speak of help, yet you expose our desperation to the entire assembly." "I expose it so everyone understands what desperation looks like," Kalen said. "So when you vote on sanctions and penalties, you know that the species you're punishing is already starving. I expose the Colossian constitutional crisis so you understand that their votes aren't about human behavior at all. They're about survival. I expose the Xylos representative's personal situation so you understand that even the most ancient among us cannot separate their public duties from their private hearts." He paused. The assembly was utterly silent. "And I expose myself," he said. 43 years I've stood in corners. 43 years I've fixed problems and let others take credit. And 43 years I've told myself that results matter more than recognition. And maybe that's true. But today, I needed you to see me. I needed you to understand that the humans standing before you are not children playing at diplomacy. We are people who have spent decades learning your languages, your customs, your hidden needs, and secret fears. We are people who have been paying attention." He stepped back. His legs felt unsteady. His voice had begun to crack near the end. "The Verathi need food. The Colossians need a way out of a constitutional trap. The Xylos need continued access to medical supplies. And humans need to be seen as something other than children. Something other than newcomers. Something other than primitive." He looked at Ambassador Voss. "We need an audience." The silence stretched. Kalen became acutely aware of every breath he took, every shift of weight, every subtle sound in the vast hall. He had no backup, no prepared statements, no carefully arranged leverage waiting in the wings. He had only the words he had spoken and the silence that followed them. The Xylos delegate moved. It was a small motion, a slight tilt of the head, a shifting of posture that on a Xylos indicated deep consideration. The translator emitted a soft chime. "This one's grandchild," the delegate said, "is named Thyr. She is 12 cycles old. She wishes to become a xenobiologist. She corresponds regularly with human researchers who study respiratory adaptation in low-gravity environments. This one has read every letter she sends, sometimes many times." Another pause. "This one did not know that humans were aware of her condition. And this one did not know that humans continued to supply medical equipment despite this one's official voting record. This one has been ashamed of that discrepancy for some time." The translator fell silent. The delegate's posture shifted again. "This one is grateful." The Colossian representative stirred. "The documents, the agreements with the breakaway factions, these were negotiated in good faith. The breakaway factions are still Colossian, still our people. We sought to maintain connection with them, even as political divisions made official communication impossible. If we violated our own constitution in doing so, perhaps the constitution requires examination rather than the negotiations require condemnation." The Verathi delegate remained still for a long moment. Then, slowly, the hood of the great robe shifted. The famine," the delegate said. "It began with a blight, a fungus we had not encountered before. It spread through our grain stores before we recognized the threat. By the time we understood what we faced, 3 colonies were already affected. We did not request assistance because we did not wish to appear weak. We did not wish to become dependent. We did not wish to owe." The hood tilted. "Perhaps we already owe." Ambassador Voss had not spoken. Her antennae remained still, but her expression had shifted from confusion to something else. Something Kalen could not immediately identify. "Mr. Moore," she said, "how long have you served with the diplomatic corps?" 22 years, Ambassador. "And before that?" "Military intelligence, 13 years. "And before that?" Kalen hesitated. "I grew up on a colony station. Now, my parents were engineers. I repaired environmental systems." "How old were you when you repaired your first environmental system?" 7. A filter had clogged. No one else was available. Voss nodded slowly. "So 43 years. 43 years of fixing things that broke, anticipating needs that hadn't been expressed, understanding systems that others found incomprehensible. 43 years without anyone noticing. I didn't want to be noticed. But today you did." Kalen met her eyes. "Today I did." The ambassador was silent for several seconds. Then she turned to face the assembly. "The Terran Confederation requests a recess," she said. 4 standard hours. During this recess, I invite the Varathi, Colossian, and Xylos delegations to meet with us privately. We have much to discuss, and I believe we can find solutions that serve all of our people." She looked at Kalen. "Mr. Moore will represent Terran interests in these discussions." "Ambassador," Kalen said, "I'm not a diplomat. I'm a technician." "You were a technician," Voss said. "Now you're something else." The private chamber was small, windowless, designed for conversations that required discretion. Kalen sat at the center of the table, flanked by Voss and 2 other human diplomats who had been hastily briefed on the situation. Across from him sat the Varathi, Colossian, and Xylos delegates, their various postures communicating degrees of discomfort and cautious interest. The negotiations took 3 hours. Kalen did not speak much during the first hour. He listened to the Varathi delegates' halting description of the blight, or to the agricultural specialists who confirmed the damage, to the logistical experts who calculated food requirements and shipping timelines. He listened to the Colossian representative explain the constitutional crisis in greater detail, to their legal advisors debate potential resolutions, to the quiet admission that the breakaway factions were not truly separate but merely alienated. He listened to the Xylos delegate describe Thyr's medical condition, her research ambitions, her correspondence with human scientists who had become her unofficial mentors. In the second hour, Kalen began to speak. He did not present demands or ultimatums. He did not leverage the secrets he had accumulated or threaten exposure. Instead, he asked questions, precise, the careful questions that illuminated the gaps between what each party wanted and what each party needed. The Varathi needed food, but they also needed dignity. The Colossians needed constitutional resolution, but they also needed to maintain connection with their breakaway factions. The Xylos delegate needed continued medical access for Thyr, but also needed to maintain standing with her own government. Each need created constraints. Each constraint created opportunities. Kalen proposed a framework: emergency food shipments from Terran border colonies, designated as humanitarian aid rather than trade goods, with no repayment required and no public announcement of the Varathi famine. Concurrent negotiations between Colossian factions, facilitated by neutral Terran mediators, aimed at constitutional reform and reunification. Expanded medical exchange programs between human and Xylos research institutions, with Thyr's correspondence formalized into an official mentorship that would benefit both species. The delegates discussed, they debated, they raised objections and proposed modifications, and gradually, incrementally, arrived at consensus. In the third hour, they began drafting. Kalen's datapad recorded every word, every amendment, every carefully negotiated compromise. His fingers moved across the screen with the same efficiency he had applied to translation matrices and environmental systems. He was still fixing things. He was still anticipating needs. But now people watched him do it. Ambassador Voss observed with an expression Kalen could not quite read. The other human diplomats deferred to him with increasing frequency. Since the alien delegates addressed their questions to him directly, seeking clarification, offering alternatives. When the final document was complete, the Varathi delegate made a sound that the translator rendered as satisfaction, reluctant respect. "This human," the delegate said, "he has been watching us for a long time." "Yes," Voss said, "he has." "Why did he not speak sooner?" Kalen considered the question. "Because speaking changes things. Once you've spoken, you can't go back to silence. Once you've been seen, you can't return to invisibility. I wasn't ready for that until today." And now, Kalen looked at the document on his datapad, at the signatures accumulating at the bottom. At the agreements that would feed colonies and resolve constitutional crises and connect a young Xylo scientist with mentors who had been waiting for her without knowing it. Now I have reasons to be seen. The assembly reconvened at the scheduled hour. The resolution was presented, debated briefly, and passed with overwhelming support. The Varathi famine would be addressed without public humiliation. The Colossian constitutional crisis would be resolved through facilitated negotiation. The Xylo's medical exchange program would expand and formalize. And Kalen Moore, technician, repairman, invisible fixer of broken systems, stood at the center of the human delegation with his hands at his sides and his voice ready to speak. He refused backup. What he needed was an audience, and for the first time in 43 years, he had one. The aftermath was not dramatic. Kalen did not receive medals or promotions or public recognition beyond a quiet commendation filed in his personnel record. Ambassador Voss did not make speeches about his heroism or demand that the assembly acknowledge his contributions. The alien delegates did not sing his praises or request his ongoing involvement in their affairs. Instead, something simpler happened. The next morning, when Kalen arrived at the assembly hall to run his usual diagnostics, the security officer at the entrance nodded to him by name. The catering staff, who normally ignored him completely, asked if he wanted his usual tea. A junior diplomat from the Varathi delegation approached him with a question about translation protocols and addressed him as Mr. Moore rather than technician. Small things, invisible things, to anyone who hadn't been paying attention, but Kalen noticed them all. 3 weeks later, he received a message. It was addressed to him personally, routed through diplomatic channels, stamped with the official seal of the Xylo's delegation. The message contained no text, only an attachment. A holographic image of a young Xylos, barely past adolescence, standing in what appeared to be a research laboratory. She was holding a datapad displaying a human-written paper on respiratory adaptation in low-gravity environments. Her posture communicated what the translator would have rendered as joy, enthusiasm, contentment. The image caption read, "Thir 12 cycles, xenobiologist." Kalen saved the image to his personal files, his first personal files in 43 years of service. That evening, Ambassador Voss found him in his usual corner. She did not ask why he was still standing against walls when he could have taken a seat at the delegation table. She simply stood beside him for a long moment, watching the assembly prepare for the next day's sessions. "You know," she said eventually, "we have an opening for a deputy diplomatic liaison. It involves a lot of negotiation, a lot of reading between the lines, a lot of understanding what people need before they know how to ask for it. The pay is better. The visibility is significantly higher." Kalen was quiet for a moment. "I'll think about it." Voss nodded. "Take your time." She paused. "But not too much time. Some doors only stay open for so long." She left. Kalen remained in his corner, his datapad warm against his forearm, his tea cooling on the shelf beside him. 43 years. 43 years of watching, waiting, fixing, fading. 43 years of telling himself that invisibility was a choice, that service was its own reward, that recognition was a distraction from the work itself. He had believed it, mostly. He had built his entire life around that belief. But today, a 12-cycle-old xenobiologist on a research station in contested space knew his name. Today, a Varathi junior diplomat asked for his opinion on translation protocols. Today, an ambassador offered him a door. Tomorrow, he would decide whether to walk through it. For now, he stood in his corner, drinking his tea, watching the Galactic Assembly prepare for another day of arguments and negotiations and desperate attempts to balance law against need, custom against survival, pride against simple human decency. For now, he was visible. It was, he discovered, not as frightening as he had always imagined. It was, in fact, something like coming home. He took the position, not immediately. He waited a full week, observing the assembly's rhythms, studying the delegates' behaviors, analyzing the subtle shifts in alliance that followed the resolution's passage. He wanted to be certain that his decision was not simply a reaction to novelty, that he was not trading one form of invisibility for another, that the door Ambassador Voss had offered led somewhere he actually wanted to go. On the 7th day, he submitted his application. The Deputy Diplomatic Liaison position required Senate confirmation, which required public hearings, which required Kalen to sit at a table under bright lights and answer questions about his qualifications, his philosophy, then his 43 years of invisible service. Senators from 17 species asked him about translation protocols and intelligence gathering and the ethics of leveraging private information for public outcomes. Kalen answered each question directly, without evasion or apology. He explained his methods without defensiveness, and his motivations without sentimentality. He did not claim to be a hero or a visionary or even particularly a diplomat. He was, he said, a technician who had learned to apply his skills to systems larger than environmental controls and translation matrices. The confirmation passed unanimously. His first official act as Deputy Diplomatic Liaison was to request a formal meeting with the Varathi agricultural delegation. His second was to establish a working group on constitutional reform with the Colossian factions. And his third was to initiate correspondence with Thur, the 12-cycle-old xenobiologist, regarding potential human xylos research collaborations. None of these acts were dramatic. None of them made headlines across the Confederation or earned him standing ovations in the assembly hall. They were, in their way, as invisible as the work he had always done. But now people watched him do it. Now, when he stood at the delegation table, other delegates addressed him by name. Now, when he proposed solutions, other diplomats asked follow-up questions. Now, when he entered the assembly hall in the morning, the security officer nodded, the catering staff offered his usual tea, and the junior diplomats from a dozen species greeted him with careful respect. He refused backup. What he needed was an audience. And an audience, he discovered, was not simply a collection of observers. An audience was not passive witnesses or silent judges. An audience was participants, people who saw what you did and responded, questioned, challenged, supported, people who held you accountable for your words and your silences, people who expected you to show up day after day and do the work you had claimed as your own. 43 years he had worked alone. 43 years he had solved problems and anticipated needs and fixed broken systems without ever asking anyone to witness his labor. He would not work alone again. On his 100th day as Deputy Diplomatic Liaison, Kalen received a message from the Xylos delegate. The delegate's posture in the attached holographic image communicated satisfaction, pride, gratitude. Beside the delegate stood a young Xylos scientist, older now, holding a research award in human xenobiology. The image caption read, Thur, 115 cycles. Doctor. Kalen saved the image to his personal files. Then he stood, collected his datapad, and walked toward the assembly hall to begin the day's work. There were systems to repair, problems to solve, needs to anticipate. He had spent 43 years preparing for this work. Now, finally, he had someone to do it with. He refused backup. What he needed was an audience, and for the first time in his life, he had both.